Hello, and welcome to my Blockchain Tech Talk. I'm Dave Wakeman, and I'm a technical evangelist for blockchain and cloud at IBM. Today, I want to show you how to get started with Hyperledger Fabric. I'm going to assume that you probably already know something about blockchain and maybe even something about Fabric, but don't worry if you don't. That's not really a prerequisite for what we're going to do today. Hyperledger Fabric is an open source project for private permission blockchains. It's hosted by the Linux Foundation and is maintained by a robust community of almost 200 companies. That community also maintains documentation that can help you learn all about it. In fact, we'll use that documentation today. And so what I've done to make it easy for myself to always find the documentation is to create a short URL for it. If you go to ibm.biz/dw_fabric docs, that should take you to the documentation. And so there's a lot of information in here for you that you can use, from just learning how to get started to some of the key concepts of what it means to work in a Hyperledger Fabric environment, operations guides when you need to, if you need to set things up, architecture, and a lot. But what we're going to do today is focus on one of the tutorials that's out here for writing your first application. And so in order to do that, we first need to have an environment to work with. And so the first thing we need to do is go to this other tutorial and do part of that to make sure we have an environment in place. We don't need to do all of this because some of what happens here also is done in the writing your first application tutorial, so we'll skip those parts. I've already loaded all the prerequisites that I need on my laptop just to save time. There are things like curl and Docker Compose and npm and Node.js if you want to write your code in Node, or Go if you want to work with Go. But I've already got all those things installed on my machine. They don't take too long to install, but I wanted to save some time here. The other thing we need to do is download some sample code. So in this portion of the tutorial, it walks us through how to do that. So the first thing we need to do is actually clone the Git repo that's in GitHub that we can use as a starting point. So you can put this in whatever directory you want. So this is the one called Twitch demo from my directory. So if I clone into here, it'll create a Fabric samples directory. That was all quick and easy. So the next thing we need to do is cd into that directory, right? And then we need to do a git checkout to a specific version. I have version 1.1.0 of Hyperledger Fabric on my machine because that matches the version of Fabric that I'm using in IBM Cloud. And this just helps me to make sure that my artifacts that I'm using here match the same version that I'm going to install locally. So that was the first step, and that was actually pretty easy that we did right here. The next thing we need to do is download some platform-specific binaries to do some of the things we need to do later in the lab. So we'll go ahead and run that real quick. And then what that's going to do is use curl to download these things into a bin directory within Fabric samples. Now, in my case, I've done this a couple of times before, and so it's already downloaded all of the Docker images that we're going to need for today's exercise. If you're doing this for the first time on your own laptop, that will take a little bit more time because there are several images it needs to download. But here it's just grabbing the actual samples code that we need to do. And then it's actually going to go through the script and check to make sure that it's got all the right Docker images, but I know that I've already got them, so that shouldn't take too long. So that is this step right here. And once we're done with that, you can read more about what goes into here later on as we go. The last thing we're going to want to do is, since we're going to be running some commands from the command line, is to probably set the path so that in this terminal window, we have the right path established for those commands. So we don't have to type it in all the time. So I'm going to grab that. We come back over here. It's probably getting close to done. Okay, so now it's checking the Docker images. And it's finding the ones that we need are already there, no problem. These last few we don't actually need for the lab. Okay, so let's go ahead and export the path to make sure we have that. All right, good to go. So that should be it for here. So we can go back to building your first network. The one last thing we need to do is to actually go and run this script that's a part of the build your first network lab to generate some artifacts. Now, we don't have to do all the rest of the stuff, but we will need these artifacts in the other lab when we stand up our network. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. And so, yep, awesome. We're good to go there. No problem. All right, so I think we're done with this section. There's more to what's going on here. When you'll see when we run the other script, a lot of the same things are happening. There's a lot of great detail here. If you really want to know what's going on here, it's all well documented here. But I think we're good to go. So let's go back here. We've done that, and now we're ready to get started here. So the way this tutorial is structured is that we have a blockchain network, right? That's the actual running environment that we're about to stand up. And then we're going to install some chain code or a smart contract into that network. So our specific application chain code for FabCar is the name of it, right, is going to be installed there. And then the third piece is we're going to have some application client code, right? So we have to have something that we're able to use to interact with Fabric, to do queries, to invoke the chain code, and there's a couple of administrative things we need to do as well. That's all application code that we downloaded as a part of that samples package. So the first thing we need to do is get our environment set up. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We go back over here. So this FabCar directory is where those artifacts are at. And so you can see a few of them here. We'll take a look at these in a little more detail in just a minute. But because this is a Node.js application, we have to actually run npm install to pull down all of the prerequisite libraries that it needs. And this will take a couple of minutes. It's going through the package.json file, which contains all the dependencies, and it's pulling all those libraries down into my directory. So while that's going on, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the code. So I'm going to use VS Code. You can use any editor you like. I just happen to like VS Code. And so this is that same Fabric samples directory. And so the actual chain code that gets deployed in the step we're about to do is here. And so don't worry if you don't know a lot about this code. I mean, it's just Node.js code, and I had to go through and read it and learn it as well. All we really need to know at this point is that there's a number of different functions that are described here. Those are the transactions that we want to invoke that are part of our smart contract. So we have one here called query car that we can use to retrieve the details about a specific one of the cars, the assets that we have on the ledger. We have an init ledger function, which is actually used to set the network up. So it pre-populates a number of cars into the network for us automatically. We have a create car. So if we need to create a new car, and we'll do this in a minute, we have a function we can use to put a new one into the ledger. Another function that we can use to query to get all the cars back from the ledger. And then my favorite one, which you'll see why in a minute, is to be able to change car owner. So once an asset is already out there, that car is already in the ledger, it may change ownership for some reason. So here's a function we can use to do that. So let's go back and take a look at our, good, so that's done, great. So the next thing we need to do is actually spin up the network. So let's run another script to do that. And so this script is going to go and do all of these things we need to do to set up and configure our network. So while that's running, that's going to take a minute or two. Let's go back and look at some of the rest of the code. So this was the chain code itself. That's actually going to be installed into our blockchain network in just a minute. But the rest of the code that we'll be interacting with is actually the client code. And that's in this directory here. And so you can see, again, those scripts that we saw earlier. The two that we're going to work with are query, which basically creates a connection and submits those query functions that I showed you using information in this request object. This is all we'll need to modify to be able to do the different queries that we want. And then the other code, which is the invoke code, which is going to have a similar structure and with another request object that is right here. That, we will specify. And the way this is set up is that The chain code ID is which actual smart contract, which chain code we want to execute because we have more than one deployed, what function we want to call, and arguments that need to be passed into that function, and what channel my chain code is running on, because I can actually deploy chain code into multiple channels. So let's see how our network's doing. Still going. Okay. So let's go back to the lab document for just a second. So we're going to need to do a couple of administrative things first. So I did all the cleanup that was already there. I didn't need to do that. So we did the npm install. That's what you saw me do a minute ago. This is what's running now to establish our network. And what it's doing is it's going out and standing up all the different Docker containers. It's running commands to link them together, to join them into channels, and to install and instantiate that chain code that I showed you earlier into the network. And there's a lot of moving parts there, so sometimes this will take a minute or two, but it should be done here in just a second. In the meantime, let's go back and look at the code again. What we're going to do first is we're going to invoke the query. And it should give us back a list of all the cars that are out there. So hopefully the setup works and our cars will be out there and we should be able to quickly see that they're out there. And oh, good. So the network is established. And so before we do that, though, we need to be able to enroll the admin user. So the admin user was registered with the network when it was created, when we were just running this last script. But we still have to use the enroll command to be able to retrieve the certificate for that user, so that we can use it later if we need it. So let's do that. And there's the certificate. It gets stashed into a key store. And there's that one. So the next thing we need to do is actually create a regular user that we can use. And this is the user that's going to submit and sign the transactions that we're about to execute. So let's do that guy. So good. We've enrolled member user 1, and we can use that user to execute transactions. Awesome. So the next thing we should be able to do is run that query. The way it's initially set up is it will return all the cars in the network. So remember I showed you that init ledger function? Here's a list of all those cars that are in the ledger. So they did make it into my network. Awesome. But maybe I really just want to query for one of the cars, not for all of them. So as you walk through this document, you can see more explanation of what's going on than what I'm covering here if you want to learn more about what's actually happening here. But what we need to do is modify this request object to have different arguments being passed in. So if we go into the code, and this is the query, so we replace this guy and with this. All we've really done is change the arguments here. We save that, and we go back and we can run that query again. And so this time, instead of getting a list of all the cars, we got just one of them back, car 4, which is the one whose key we passed in through the function. So that's cool. So now we've been able to query for all the cars. We can query for a specific one. But what about creating one? So the next step in the document in the lab is to actually go and create one. So here's where the fun begins. So let's go ahead and create a car. We need to update that request object in invoke.js. This is our client code to execute transactions. So here it is again. Just make sure I get it right here. Replace that with this. And you know what? I'm feeling kind of sporty today. So instead of creating a Volt, let's create a Corvette. That's kind of fun. And we'll make it black, because all Corvettes should be black, right? Okay, cool. So we got that. So now, if we go and run the invoke function, or the invoke program, the JavaScript command, JavaScript, that's actually submitting a transaction into blockchain to, add a new car to the ledger. And oh, good, it worked. So you can see that some things happened and the transaction got completed and the change was committed to the ledger. So we're all good to go. So if we go and look, so that was car, what did we create here? Car 10. Okay, so if we go back to our query, remember we queried for car 4 before. So if we query for car 10, we should get our new car back that we just created. And oh, indeed, there is the Corvette. Awesome. But what will be even more awesome is if I own that Corvette. So let's do that. So we have another function, remember, called change car owner. And so we need to be able to pass it in the right artifacts. In this case, in the invoke, what we need to pass it in is this information. So now we're going to call the change car owner function in our chain code, pass in the car ID and who the new owner should be. And lo and behold, if we run that function again, I made a typo. Yep, sure did. All right, bear with me. There we go. Live demo. Awesome, there we go. So that time it worked. So remember, we just queried for car 10 above here, and it showed here it is, and Nick is the owner. If I run that exact same query again, now it shows that I own the Corvette, and that is the perfect place to end my demo. So there you have it. In just 15 minutes, we're able to stand up a network on a local machine and configure it and get it up and running, deploy some chain code, and then run some transactions against our ledger. You can do all this locally. It's all documented in this lab document. I also have the same chain code running in IBM Blockchain Platform and IBM Cloud. And so it's basically a continuation of this lab document. And if you are curious as to how I did that, there's actually a document published to IBM Developer Works that walks you through exactly how to do that. So between the Fabric tutorial here and this lab document, or this Developer Works article here, you can actually run this either locally or in IBM Cloud. That's it. Thanks for joining.